and I'd like to welcome you to the 5th Meadows Valley Memories. And once again, we're back to our early settlers. This is Early Settlers 4. And thank you for coming. Tonight's panelists are Leonard, Wallace, Thelma, Ratzat, Creason, and representing the Branstetter family is Nita Branstetter. Our moderator is historian Dale Fisk from Council. Sometimes, as you may have noticed, our panelists change from those that are advertised in the newspaper, and that's usually due to unforeseen circumstances, and we just find somebody to fill in and forge onward. Thanks again to Dale Fisk and this evening's panelists. Please welcome them.
Okay, we'll see how well we can make these microphones work. We always try to get them adjusted, but it's kind of a guess as to how loud they should be and whether they feedback. Well, let's start with Nita Branstetter, who's taking Oscar's place tonight. And in previous sessions, we didn't really get into the Branstetter story. So Nita, why don't you kind of tell us from the beginning forward and kind of where you come into the picture and just a general idea.
Okay, and incidentally, I believe we're going to go down and interview Oscar and video him down where he lives in Weezer and try to incorporate it into this video tonight. This history was written by Hazel Branstetter. The William Branstetter family came to Meadows Valley in the spring of 1907. The family consisted of William Branstetter, born in Millville, Missouri in 1868, Rhoda Drake Branstetter, his wife, born in 1868, their 2 children, Grace and Ward. They came here by team and wagon and settled on a place down by the Meadows Valley Hot Springs. William got a land sale patent on January 27, 1908. It was known for years as the Old Branstetter Place. They lived there until their death. William Branstetter was 17 years old when he decided to leave home and come west. He traveled by whatever means was available, stopping near Jackson Hole, Wyoming, where sheep shearing was in full swing and was all done by hand. He joined the crew, and after learning the trade, he made it his full-time occupation. His job took him to Wyoming, Idaho, Montana, Oregon, and many other places. While traveling on the job, the crew stopped at a small restaurant near Bozeman, Montana. Here, William met Rhoda Ann Drake, the manager of the restaurant. He married her on December 15, 1898. William and Rhoda made their home at Chimney Rock, Montana, where William worked in a butcher shop. 2 children were born to them. Grace was born on April 14, 1900, and Ward was born on April 14, 1901. The Indians that came to camp, fish, and hunt near the hot springs and the Salmon River often frightened the Branstetters. Ward and Grace attended school at Meadows for several years. During this time period, Mrs. Branstetter moved to Meadows. She went home on the weekends until Ward and Grace were old enough to ride a horse to the Middle District School, where they each completed the 8th grade. William Branstetter was county commissioner for the district for 20 years. He worked on the county road and also helped to build the highway through the valley, as well as working on the agreement for the New Meadows Goose Creek Road. He was also one of the founders of the Goose Creek Canal, along with Charles Campbell and Frank Delbar, who signed the agreements to acquire right-of-way through the valley. He was a very active member of the Oddsfellows Lodge and other common affairs, and was also a politician. Rhoda was also very active. She was a member of the Rebecca Lodge and involved in other clubs and school affairs. She helped with anything she could and did her best. She was greatly loved by all who knew her. Rhoda died in 1918. William died in 1929. He had married Ella McReynolds Forbes on June 7, 1925. Grace married John Forbes, and they had one daughter, Maureen. Grace died in 1942. Ward married Hazel Hubbard March 28, 1923, and they had 7 children. He died in August 1953, and Hazel died July 22nd, 1980. Those children are William, Bill, Oscar, Doris, Melvin, Charles, Helen, and Don. Charlie died in 1995. Doris also died, as did Oscar's wife, Doris. I have a little thing here I'd like to read out of the County Commissioners, October 29, 1929. The Meadows Goose Creek Road, a cooperative agreement having been received from the State Highway Department relating to the construction of the new Meadows Goose Creek Highway and to the payments to be made therefore by the federal government, the state, and Adams County, and said agreement not being informed satisfactory to the board, the prosecuting attorney is requested to take the matter up with the Highway Department for an adjustment. In previous meetings, memory meetings, there have been questions about that Goose Creek Road. And then the following resolution is passed regarding the death of Commissioner Branstetter. Whereas we, the Board of County Commissioners of Adams County, learned with sorrow of the death of our friend and co-worker, William Branstetter, and whereas Mr. Branstetter was a man of sound judgment, impartial and unbiased mind, who during his several years as service as county commissioner from the 3rd District was deeply interested in the progress and general welfare of Adams County, and whereas by his death the county loses a loyal friend and efficient officer. Therefore be it resolved that this board on behalf of Adams County extend to his bereaved wife, son, and daughter our sincere sympathy, that a copy of this resolution be spread upon the minutes of the board and published, and that a copy be sent to the wife of the deceased. Thereupon the board takes a recess until November 9th, 1929. I thought that's rather interesting.
So,
I was curious about exactly which section of road is this that we were talking about before this? The Meadows Goose Creek Road. What?
Well, it'd be the one going up the hill.
Up the hill. Oh, okay.
that's what I assumed, but
Yeah.
good question.
That's what I wondered.
So tell us when you come into the picture. Now, who did you marry?
I married Charlie Branstetter.
Charlie, and that's Oscar's brother.
Mhm.
And how and when did that happen? Fill us in on a little bit of your background up to the point where you married Charlie.
Well, I was born in Kuna, Idaho, and came here in 1947. Charlie and I went to school together, and we got married in 1950. I've been a Branstetter ever since.
What did Oscar and Charlie do as far as a livelihood around here?
They both worked on the ranch out
Yeah.
there.
And where was the ranch?
It's on the 45th parallel, right straight up from...
On the east side of the highway?
Yeah, on the east side and up, it would be about 2 miles, I guess.
Okay. That's pretty much what they did their whole careers, or did they work together on the same ranch? Or?
Yeah, Charlie and Oscar worked for years together out there, and they sort of divided it up, and Oscar run one part, and we ran the other part of it. And then in 1970, we moved to town, and Charlie worked out at the sawmill for the rest of his life.
At Tamarack? What's the status of the ranch now?
Well, it was divided up after Hazel died, and Stanley acquired Oscar's portion of it here in the last couple of years, and we have, well, I have what Charlie had, of course. There's, I think, let's see, 200 acres of pasture ground, and then we have 120 acres of timber ground. And Melvin has about the same. And Helen has two 80s, or two 40s, 180 acres, I guess. And Bill has 80, about 100 acres. We all share a timber pasture up there. And Don had about the same amount, and then part of that's what got sold for Canyon Creek subdivision. Just briefly, Ward Branstetter, who was Charlie's dad, acquired quite a bit of ground. He started purchasing his land in 1926. He purchased the George McMahon place and had a deed dated 1926, although it wasn't filed until 1928. And also some of the Jonathan McMahon place. Then he bought the Knowles place, purchased from Reynolds, in 1942.
What general area were these places kind of adjacent?
They're all
to each
together,
other?
yeah.
Out which way from town?
East,
Yeah.
like I said, along 45th parallel sort of divides it into. The Knowles place, purchased from Reynolds in 42. The Walker place was homesteaded by V.A. Jones, who purchased from Walker. The Luce place was purchased by Carl Ratzat, and then Ward purchased it from Carl Ratzat in 1942. That was the Luce homestead in 1905. The Jones place, I think he purchased it from Richard Balbach. Richard Balbach was took out mortgages for many, many people here in the valley. And I think I'd seen a deed that said anyway, Nancy Jones homesteaded in 1906, and I put a homestead certificate over there and said Nancy Jones, deserted wife of Thomas Jones, et cetera, et cetera. And in 1946, he purchased the place from Ella Branstetter, who Charlie's grandfather married after his wife had died. And then he also purchased approximately 948 acres of Boise Cascade land up behind Circle C there. And I think it was in the 40s. I couldn't find the deed, so I'm not sure just what year, but it was in the mid-40s.
That's a lot of purchasing. That doesn't happen so much anymore.
He had about 1,800 acres altogether.
Yeah. What would you say are the factors that, like I say anymore, it seems harder and harder to buy land, especially for agriculture, it just doesn't pay for itself. When did you personally start to see that changing, where people just couldn't afford to buy land like that?
Oh, probably started in the 80s maybe.
Really, that recently?
That was pretty reasonable, well, maybe 70s or so.
Yeah.
But way back here, you know, like the Boise Cascade property, I think it was 2.5 an acre. something like that.
$2.5?
Yeah. I don't know, maybe it was more than that. I've seen that price someplace. And whole, you know, 440s, 160 acres would go for maybe $2,000.
Of course, money would buy more now, but...
Oh, yeah. And people could make a living on it back then. But harder and harder. Of course, land is, you know, people are wanting to develop and all that now, so a person couldn't possibly buy a place. And
How many ranchers in the valley had forest permits, grazing permits on the forest? Was that real common, or was most of the grazing right here in the valley? Or?
yeah, we used to have the permit out there. We ran cattle out in the forest, and there were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 at that time, I think.
People that had permits?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't know how many there are now. I don't think there are that many.
I just
Maybe.
had one more question. You said that William Branstetter had a place by the hot springs. Are you talking about Zim's?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Now, it was on the way down there. You turn off the highway and go down, and then you turn down that way. Then it was right in the middle there. And he acquired that in a patent through land sale. And then I think Ward probably sold that in the 40s to Dick Armacost. And I don't think there was anybody who lived there after that. The house is no longer there.
Yeah. Was that south of the Hot Springs somewhere?
No, it was east.
East?
Yeah,
On which side of the highway?
on the west side of the highway.
Okay, well, Thelma, let's kind of do the same thing with you. Let's have a little background on your family and where you come into the picture, or were you born into the picture, or give us a little background.
Well, my mother moved to New Meadows Valley when she was 3 years old. She was born in Roseberry.
Now, what was her name?
Her name was Wallace, Hattie Wallace. And well, I have a little bit of the history of my mother. Her great-grandfather, Sparlin, on her mother's side, came to the United States from Spain and married an Indian girl. And that's why my brother's pictures are, he has dark hair and skin, and my mother had gold black hair. Her maternal grandparents were Mark and Cynthia Cole of Joplin, Missouri, and her paternal grandparents were George and Sarah Wallace of Seneca, Missouri. Her parents were Ellis Delanius Wallace and Martha Amita Cole. And they had both came from Missouri, and then they met out here and were married. They were among the first the settlers in Long Valley, Idaho in 1889. Ellis Wallace married Martha Cole in Roseberry, Idaho in 1891. Their first children were twins, Mark and George, that were born in Payette. Mark died shortly after birth, and George lived from February the 4th till March the 16th. The following children were born in Roseberry: Elijah on April 1st, 1892, Clarence on May 23rd, 1893, Laura on August 18th, 1894, my mother Hattie on May the 1st, 1896, Walter in 1897. In the fall of 1899 is when the family with those 7 children moved to Meadows Valley. And they lived out on the Wallace Lane, just this side of where Leonard and Kay live now. When the following children were born there: Ellis in 1899, he just lived for 3 years. Paul, October of 1900, Sarah in 1902, Frank in 1903, Matt in 1904, Bertha in 1905, Charlie in 1907, Ethel in 1909, a baby in 1912 were stillborn, and one was stillborn in 1913, making 17 children in all.
What was the mother's name? Mark. How old did she live to be?
53, I believe.
Wow.
And Mother grew up on a ranch northwest of the present town of New Meadows. That would be out on Wallace Lane. The town site of Old Meadows was the first town in the valley. She attended 10 years of schooling in the Middle District School, located all by itself in a grove of trees in an area between their home ranch and the present-day town of New Meadows. The students either walked or rode horses to school. The building was a 2-story with classes above and below. Her brother Charlie purchased the old school building years later, and Leonard tells me that it was co-purchased by somebody else, that I didn't have that. And used the lumber to build a barn. her father was very, very strict, and the girls were not allowed to date, and they worked on the ranch. When she was young, she started washing dishes and ironing clothes when she had to stand on an apple box, and she and her older sister Laura were kind of in charge of the younger children. And one day, oh well, I won't relate that. She remembered the birth of the town of New Meadows when the railroad came that far, and she also remembered the first cars built and the first planes that came to New Meadows. When she was 20 years old, Lige, Clarence, Laura, and her rented the ranch, which was later the Wilkie place down by Zims, and worked in it, sharing in equal profits. Later, Paul, Matt, and Sarah joined them. The girls carded the wool and made the quilts and did the canning. And she met Carl Ratzat at his pie social at the Middle District School in 1925. He bought her lemon pie. They were married September the 9th, 1926 in Council, Idaho. And at that time they purchased the loose place that she mentioned a while ago, and they made their home on the ranch northeast of New Meadows. And they raised peas for the San Diego Pea Company there. And then in 1943, when it was time for us to go to high school, and there's no school buses then, we moved into Meadows, and Dad worked down at the sawmill. And they had 4 children, Carl Frederick, and Thelma Marie, Walter Edward, and Robert Ray. The first home they bought in New Meadows burnt in 1945, along with the house on each side of them. They spent that winter in a home Jess Hounsleven had been renting. She had taken his sons, Jimmy 6 and August 14 months, into their home to raise, and they lived with she and Carl till they were grown. They bought a log house on the northwest corner of New Meadows the following spring, and they lived there until Carl died in 1981. She continued to live there until December of 1991, when she went to live with her daughter. That was me in Cascade. And she lived there 2 years and passed away on December the 9th, 1993. She was buried next to her husband Carl and son Walter, who had died on May the 1957 as a result of a car accident.
How many of those 17 kids, I know some of them died young, but how many of them wound up living around here?
Well, there were only 8 of them that grew to maturity, and the one, Matt, died of pneumonia when he was 21. But, of course, Uncle Charlie Wallace, Leonard's dad, lived here until he passed on. And Walter Wallace lived here. Paul Wallace never lived in this area, but Sarah married Tom Hubbard, and they had a ranch out of Meadows here. And Laura married Raleigh Drar, and they lived here in Meadows Valley.
So did you have some other things written there that you wanted to?
Not particularly.
Leonard, did you hear anything that you want to disagree with or add to? Or?
No, she done it the best. To the best of my knowledge, she done a very good job. You know, some of the dates may not be the same as what I have, but at this point, I really don't have.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about your dad and mom and
I am Leonard Wallace, Charles Wallace's second son. My dad was born right where I live, right where he born and died, right where the old family homestead was, and I have moved probably 100 yards in the last 64 years myself.
Now there's a Wallace Lane.
Yeah, that's Wallace Lane, probably has something to do with the name of it, I suppose.
What's your address out there?
And, you know, my dad was born and raised right there, and I was too, and probably I'll die there just like he did. And I do, I know, like I said, her dates and everything is right. I have a few things here I'd like to add to it. The Indians, years ago, used to come through here, and they camped out there at 3 Mile, which is a little creek that runs through our place and at the hot springs. Ellis and Martha's children used to play with these Indians in the early 1900s until it was put on the reservation. And let's see, the railroad came in here in 1913, the Pacific and Idaho Northern. Oxes were used to build the railroad. It was the first time that Ellis and Martha's children had ever seen an oxen, and so they had to go look at them, which was quite a sight for them. And would be for me too, because I've never seen one. The railroad was used to transport milk, cream, and livestock to markets other than Meadows Valley. And basically, Thelma has the same stuff from there on as I do. And what else might you...
Now, somebody said your dad might have been one of the earlier kids born here.
What?
Was your dad born
Yes,
fairly
he was
early?
born right where he died.
Was
Right
that
there.
1907?
1907.
07?
And my granddad, which was Ellis Delaney's, he come here in 1899.
Yeah. Now tell us about the Osborne barn. Was it torn down or made from the Middle District School?
Yeah.
Is that?
See, the second schoolhouse at Middle District was sold at auction sale when I was probably 10, 12 years old.
Now what year were you born?
1940. And Ward Branstetter bought half of it, and my dad bought half of it, and if I remember rightly, it was $150 a piece, which would be a total of $300 for the building. I don't have no idea what the Ward done with it, but my dad built the barn on the left-hand side of the road going up to where he lived, off of that lumber.
Yeah.
And then he cut all the poles and all the framework was cut right there on the ranch, and then him and Mother put that up, and then they used the lumber to cover the outside.
Do you have any idea why they closed that school? Were they using buses more then? Or?
All the schools at 1948 here was consolidated. There was, I don't know how many little country schools around, you know, but that was the reason why they consolidated. I went to school there the winter of 46, 47, yeah, and 47, 48. And then they closed it, and I went to Old Meadows till I was in the 8th grade, and then I come to New Meadows to the high school, which I graduated from in 1958.
And what did you do after high school?
When I left high school, I went home and helped on the ranch and one thing and another. And then Dad, he got crippled up in 73 to where he couldn't run it anymore. And we decided to sell it, which we did. And if we'd only known what was going to happen, we would have kept it, I assure you.
Price go up? So
The price went, well, we got $107,000 for it, and I don't remember now when it finally did sell, but I'm sure that, I have heard that the guy that sold it to the subdivider got $1 million. I could put a retire on that.
close. I have a note here that Carl Wallace once owned part of the Branstetter place, is that right?
Carl Ratzat
Oh, okay.
bought the Luce place, and then later Branstetters bought it from Carl.
Oh, okay. Okay, we did some stories about Indians.
I remember my mother telling about those too.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Did they sell gloves or leather things, or
Moccasins and
what did they do when they came here? Were they picking berries or something like that, or just traveling through, or do you
and
know?
they just kind of summer camped here.
Well, I actually think when the Indians come through, they went that way for deer, elk, buffalo, like down in Boise area. Because there was no deer here, well, they might have been. But my dad was born in 1907. He seen his first deer unreal as it may sound, in 1924. He was 17 years old.
Huh. They just weren't around here.
Born and raised right where I live now, and that was his first year. He actually seen elk before he seen deer because they shipped the elk in here 15 or 17.
But you couldn't hunt them.
And you know, that sounds unreal because we see deer used to every day or two.
Yeah.
Sometimes not that much anymore. There was a lot of old stories there that just don't seem quite right.
Yeah. Well, they must have hunted them pretty hard there for a while.
Well, I've heard my dad say if you wanted to kill a deer and you found a track, you better chase it because that might be the only one you've seen all day. Even later, after you finally see it.
What kind of stories do you have from growing up around here? What were some of the interesting things that happened?
Well, some of them they probably don't sound too real, but there was a guy lived out there just below my house, just below where you cross the irrigating canal, the little Circle C, by the name of Williams. And he told Dad that he heard the Nez Perce and Shoepeter Indians fight on the airport hill up here for 3 days. That's a long ways to here. That's probably 3 miles, airline. Which don't sound real, but you know, you didn't tell them old timers, they didn't know what they were talking about. And then another story, the water for that ranch come from over on the Sewell Creek drainage, over on the Goose Creek side. And they dug a ditch 1.25 miles long in the winter of 1899, in the wintertime, 1.25 miles. And it comes over the top of the hill right there behind my house.
It's still there.
It's still there, but of course there's no water in it. The Forest Service has got everybody kicked off that. And like for the neighbor, he wanted that ditch and the water. And the Forest Service, well, we got to study it for this, we got to study it for that. Finally, he just sort of his hands. I said, why didn't you just look him right in the eye and tell him have a nice day? That ditch was dug in 1899. There was no such thing as the Forest Service until the early 1900s. That's what I'd have done. I said, tell me what you want me to do, and maybe.
So who were some of the old timers around here when you were a kid that you knew or knew of, saw around?
Pardon me?
Who were some of the old timers here when you were a kid?
Well, I can remember one orphan dad, Edward. And of course I can remember Ward, but Ward wasn't a great deal older than my dad. My dad worked for Ward for several years, and that's who he was actually working for when he got, I don't know, he worked for Circle C, but he worked for Ward. And one time my dad told a story on the Ward I couldn't hardly believe. They was down in Weezer, and this car salesman was trying to sell Ward a new car, probably $800-900 maximum back then. They went around and around, finally, Ward said, tell you what I'll do. I'll just give you all the money I have in my pocket for that car. And the salesman kind of looked at him, and said, no, we can't quite do that. And Ward said, well, I want to show you how much he had. He had $1,600 in his pocket. But you know, you take an old guy in Levi's, you ain't going to figure him for $1,600. Depression.
Well, that was during the Depression.
Well, I would assume so, probably very close. And like Nita said, Richard Balbach, which would have been Bob and Dick's dad, did help a lot of the people get started there. He helped my dad wind up with that ranch. My granddad lost that ranch on a mortgage to a guy by the name of Jim Wilson. And everybody called him Dick, which is Marcia and Marion's dad, Victoria, and Wilson now. And Dick, or Richard, helped Dad get that place back, and as near as I know, there was no sign on that, a $2,000 note, and just paint that'll work. And Richard loaned my dad a lot of money, and I don't think there was ever an old sign to my knowledge.
And did that with a lot of people?
I did.
Several people?
You ain't going to leave the country, and I ain't either, and that's what Richard told me.
Thelma, did you run across any more information there or spark any memories that?
Well, I just know that Richard Balbach helped my folks buy the ranch too, their ranch. But some of the people that I knew and remember were John and Lucy Merritt, which was our neighbors between us and the Branstetters. We lived farther. And then there was Ed and May Osborne, and of course Ed and Lula McMahon. My father worked for them when he first came to New Meadows in 1925. And then Preston and Karen Wilkie had the ranch out there. It was my first job that I worked at. When the summer I was 15, I went down there and stayed and helped them with their dairy and babysit their children. And the Leddingtons lived across from them. And of course Sadie Anderson, and she was the midwife when my little brother was born. And when Hugh and Martha Crabtree had the ranch that Schaefer's had, that now somebody else has. And of course I knew all the Camels, Loyal and Raleigh and Albert and Chester Irwin, Joe Cahaw. Jack Soden had the meat market, and Stanley Parrott worked, and they had a meat market and a storage locker where you could rent lockers for your beef. And the Witherspoons, and Clarence and Fannie LaFay, and Henry and May Wilson, and Dick and I and Nez Wilson. And I worked in the Piemont Cafe, which was still going at that time before I started working in the store. And when I was a girl, they had a 5 and 10 cent store there in the area where they built those apartments that are gone now. And we could go in there and you could get a popsicle, and sometimes they had a stick in it that said free, and you could get another popsicle.
And who ran that, 5 and 9?
I have no idea. I was just a little kid looking for candy and popsicles.
Well, Nita, did you come up with any more information or any memories sparked of stories?
Oh yeah, quite a few, but they say behind every good man there's a better woman. And so we would be remiss if we didn't mention Hazel Hubbard Branstetter. I won't read the whole thing. This was one that she had written also. Her grandfather came from Lincolnshire, England, and he drove a buckboard and team of mules from the east across the Plain States to Nebraska. And then he married Elizabeth Minshaw and moved to Tarrington, Wyoming. And they moved around quite a bit. Although maybe it was the next ones that moved. Hudson Hubbard was their son, and that was Hazel's father, and he was married to Mary. And they lived, well, Hazel was born in Nebraska, and they sort of went back and forth from some of the states there. And anyway, they came to Meadows Valley in 1908 because Harry Parks, Hazel's uncle, who was brother to her mother, was killed in a train accident of some kind, and he had filed on a homestead out here on the west side of the valley. And so they came out to see the place and so on and so forth. Anyway, when they came to Meadows, they stayed in the home of Henry Dreyer, parents of Hallie Dreyer. And this is that log house just as you're going out of town. And she said they lived there for 6 months. And it's a tiny, tiny house for all those people. But they liked the valley so much because the wind didn't blow. So they sold out and sold 200 head of Texas Longhorn steers at $19 a head. And they sold their furniture and everything. And they fixed covered wagons, and so they came with and covered wagons here and moved out there, and why anybody thought they could make a living on that 160, I'll never know.
Where's that?
Oh, you're going out the old road to Zam's, the back way there, and there's one hay field, and the rest of it's just rock pile, more or less. But they lived there for years and years. And they had, let's see, parents, Mary and Hudson, grandparents, Thomas and Elizabeth, and let's see, a friend, Jim Boy from Texas. I don't know whether he's one of the Bowie Knights or what, but then 9 of his children. Clara was 17, Ethel 14, Thomas and Hazel, who were twins, were 9, Joe was 7, George 6, Robert 5, William 3, and Marie 1 year.
And what year was that?
In 1910. So they moved out here. And let's see, they would stop and, I guess, ask farmers if they could sleep in their haystack. When Hazel got really ill right before she died, and she was in the hospital, and we thought she was just rambling on, about sleeping in haystacks and stuff, but Sally got a big kick out of that too, and we thought, oh, that didn't happen. Well, when Sally was telling Chester about it, Chester was born here, he didn't come with them, but he said, yeah, that's what they did. They'd stop at ranches and sleep in haystacks. But anyway, they ran into some bandits one place. Said 5 bandits rode out in front of us wearing black masks and black hats and ordered us to stop. They were holding guns in their hands and told us to get out of the wagons. One held a gun on us and said, don't move or I'll shoot, while the others raided our wagons, taking food, axes, a hatchet, and 1 gun. And then they said, get going. We were very scared of them and left as fast as we could. Let's see, another place here. After coming over the Great Divide and into Idaho, we camped near Blackfoot. We planned to rest the horses for 2 days, do laundry, and locate a patch of choke cherries to pick and make jam. We were all settled in the camp when all at once about 25 to 30 Indians on horses rode around our camp until finally the chief stopped and asked for some smoked meat and other food. He then asked us to take care of a 9-year-old boy while they went and picked choke cherries. They soon returned, took the boy and rode away. She said, we were glad we had no trouble with them, but my father was afraid they might return, so we decided to leave at 3 a.m. the next day. She said, coming over the mountain, looking down into a small valley, we saw 50 to 75 Indian teepees. We drove very slow and quiet, being careful not to arouse the dogs or people, and they made it by okay. Anyway, she said, we were met at Evergreen, Idaho by Henry Dreyer, who drove a freight train between New Meadows and Evergreen every day. He escorted us to the valley on October 31st, 1910 after dark. I will never forget seeing that first light in Meadows Valley as we came over the hill. I still think of it every time I see it at night. And she did, because she always mentioned that. We were so happy to know our journey was completed. Mrs. Dreyer had a nice supper ready for us and huckleberry pie, which we'd never tasted before. She said 5 of us children entered school in New Meadows in an old store building owned by Ed Kaiser until the Beaumont School was finished. Oriana Hubbard was my teacher in the 3rd grade. We hear of her being a teacher for years and years and years. She said we finished all 8 grades at Beaumont. At that time, there was no high school in Meadows. There are only 3 of the Hubbards living at the time of this writing who made the trip, Hazel, Joe, and William. Chester was born on the old Hubbard place. She said there have been many changes in the valley and so much of the beautiful timber has been logged out. And she always said she had seen the worst and the best of everything, and she'd gone from, seeing the first cars to men on the moon and airplanes and television.
How does Chester fit into the family?
Chester was her brother, Hazel's brother.
Was Oriana Hubbard related?
No relation at all.
Okay.
Chester Sally was married to,
Right.
Sally was married to Chester.
Yeah. Okay. And he was born here, did you say?
Mhm.
Okay. Let's get toward 8 o'clock. How about any questions from the audience before we take a short break here? Or any stories that you know about any of these families that they missed? What was that one she skipped over there that we... Never mind. No questions. Well, let's take a short break and look at the pictures and things like that, and we have refreshments, and we'll resume here in a few minutes.
Branstetter place down by the Limbs that we was talking about. This is the house.
Looks like it had a foundation. Is there anything left there now? I guess we're going to start up again here. Hope y'all got enough to eat. Be thinking of some questions. We got some good questions during the break, and I know there were some that I missed. So be sure and bring them up when things slow down here a little bit. A couple people asked me to ask Leonard about his mother and any stories. I guess she was kind of a character.
Yes, she was. And I see there where you wanted a story about the elk she wrote. Now, my mother was quite a hunter and fisherman. And one year, well, of course, Dad and I and my brother, we kept harassing her about shooting everything full of holes and ruining all the meat. And one time she went over there behind Dick Clay's and shot this elk, 4 or 5 point bow. She got a rope, throwed it on the horn, went to look for her horse, and she heard a noise and this horse had run off. So she goes to get the horse, heard another noise. This elk jumped off and ran off with the rope, but she never did get the elk with the rope either. But yes, she was a character. She was a hard-working woman, very hard. Anything else there you did?
Was she kind of an outdoor person? Somebody said she wore...
She wore blue jeans and overalls just like the man in the work shirt. And she worked right alongside my dad. And when we was kids, my brother and I, there was printer always an older lady stayed there, just for room and board, kept the house so mother could work with her. And she worked just as hard as he did, trust me. And the funny part, the young real part, my mother contacted Hodgkin's disease in 1945, 46, somewhere along in there, which at that time they gave her 6 months. And she died in June of 1965. She made her 6 months.
What was her story? Was she from around here? Or?
My mother was from down at, up over the hill on the Snake River side from Lucille. She lived over there about 2 miles on the other side of the top. And then when she met my dad, he was working for Circle C down at Pittsburgh, and she was cooking down there, and that's how they met. And then my mother had 2 little brothers, and they was always going to whip Dad. And to this day, I don't think they ever did get it done, but they tried a lot of times.
Hey, Leonard, I knew her folks, Clay and Emma Davis.
What was your mother's name?
Sally Bial Wallace, and her maiden name was Davis.
Clay and Emma Davis.
Clay and
I
Emma
knew
Davis
them
was
real
daughter.
well. Yeah.
Where did they live?
Well, they lived on the Snake River side there, around Lucille. Yeah, Lucille.
See, my grandmother was a baker. And they bakers homesteaded, I'd say 2 or 3 miles up Kelter. from Lucille. And they was born, they stayed right there. And then my mother's uncle was Henry and Wilfred Baker. And they was quite heavy, you know, just them old timers, they was just different, that's all there is to it. Well, it wasn't different, but they done what they had to do to survive.
Tell us about your brother. He was a pilot, was he?
My brother was 2 years younger than I was, older.
What was his name?
Yeah, he was 2 years older than I. I was born in July of 40, and he was born in February of 38.
What
Yes,
was his
he had
name?
his own airplane, and we have property up Salmon River, 40 miles above the end of the road, and we put an airport in there for this piece of property. And he was in there one time flying, and they was going to go look for deer and elk the next day to shoot, him and 2 other guys. And they took off and banked the plane real hard to go upriver, and the motor died, and where it was in a stark bank like that, it just went crash to the ground and killed 3 of them instantly.
What was your brother's name?
Charles Matt Wallace.
Who were the other guys that were killed with him?
They was out, one of them was out of Albany, and, well, I guess they both was out of Albany. These people come in there out of every 2 weeks and a half since we built that place. And I'm thinking maybe this year I'm gonna get to go up there and spend my 2 weeks hunting and fishing on their dime.
Thelma, you got any memories of his mother? Sounds like she must have generated a few stories.
Oh, yes, she did. And I know that his dad and another brother, Walter, after my parents were married, they were enough younger and just young guys. And they would come, they kind of boarded with my mom and dad. And they bought us 3 older children our first tricycles. And we really thought they were pretty neat. But they stayed out there a lot until they married. But yes, his mother, and she learned to be a taxidermist, and she did some beautiful work.
Is there anything she stopped still around here?
Oh yes, go out to the Wallace place and you'll see some of them.
You gonna say something?
I said I have a story or 2 on her too. I have a story or 2 on her. Everybody sort of thought of her as, sort of rough, tough, and so forth, but she really had her feminine side too. And when she was going to go someplace, she'd have Charlie come over with her to my house and have me put her hair up in rollers for her. And I enjoyed doing it and enjoyed visiting, and Charlie visit with Charlie and so forth. But a funny story, my friend Margaret and I think she was one that had the big idea that we should go hunting. And Zella would take us hunting, so we got all fixed up to go hunting, and we were riding way up on top of the mountain there someplace, and we weren't too diligent about looking for deer or anything. Zella was riding along in front of us, and deer jumped up, and Zella's horse started bucking with her. Well, we were watching rodeo. We were getting a kick out of that because she could really ride a horse, Anyway, when she got her horse under control, she just chewed us up one side and down the other because neither one of us thought to shoot the deer. It was funny. She was a nice lady.
Yeah, I can remember when I was a boy, like 10 years old or so, my mother would leave the house out there like 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. Long in the middle of the afternoon, she would come back with a 4-point buck, probably 170, 75 pounds. And how she loaded that by herself, I will never know. But I know she done it a lot of times.
I was going to ask you about that cabin you mentioned right out here along the highway, right? You said somebody named Dreyer owned that?
Yes,
Do you know
yes.
anything about the history of that building? When it was
Well,
built?
they came here in, gosh, I think the 1800s or so.
Did they
And-
build it prior?
And, oh, I'm sure they did. And they had a homestead. Well, I don't know where their homestead was. That may be where the homestead was, because I think they owned the property on both sides of the highway. And then a little farther out too, I think they owned some property.
Is that cabin set right there? It's never been moved or anything?
Right.
Yeah.
I've been here as long as I've been around.
Anybody else know anything about it? Some of you know more about the house or the family or anything?
We can get hold of Gene Heminger, he can tell you about it,
Okay.
because he married a dryer.
Okay. So we don't cover that. Thelma, you didn't say much about your father and his story.
My father was born in Germany in 1896, and his mother was Augusta Rain before her marriage to Fred Ratzat. And the whole family moved to South America. And when he was 16 and his little sister was only 2 months old. And after a couple of years over there, Carl and his dad came up into Canada. And they gradually worked their way to the United States. And his mom and Helen had stayed behind over in Brazil, where she did housekeeping for other German families. After he had established a place in Oregon, well, he had sent for them, but my dad and his dad separated, and he lost complete track of where any of his family were for years. As a boy, he attended school year-round from age 6 to 14, and then took up a trade, and the trade that he chose to take up was a baker. His parents were Lutheran, and he envied the children in the Catholic schools as they had vacations from school, but he didn't. Dad and his father and a cousin came to Canada when he was 17. They'd never heard of the United States, just Canada. They worked in the fields during haying and other jobs. This was difficult as they could not speak English. He became separated from his father, and he met up with him again in Montana, where his dad was working in a coal mine, as he had been doing in Germany. His mother and his little sister were still in Brazil. And then they were separated, he and his dad were separated again. And without the proper papers to stay in the United States, he was given the choice to either leave or join the military. And so he joined the Army, and he was stationed at Fort Columbia, where he worked and cared for horses and also drove an officer's jeep. And he was hospitalized with the flu when his regiment went overseas, so he didn't go overseas. He learned the English language and how to write in our language while he was in the service. After the war, he and a friend bought a cafe in Portland. Later, they bought a Model A and traveled across Oregon and Idaho and ended up in New Meadows. He worked for a rancher named Ed McMahon. In 1925, he met my mother at the Middle District School Pie Social. Some friends of the McMahons, Lola and Laura York, came to visit from Salem, Oregon, and they got acquainted with Dad. After returning to Salem, they were at a friend's home looking at pictures. One was of Helen Ratzat. Upon hearing that name, they asked questions and then went to Fred and Augusta Rain, Ratzat, and told them of the meeting of Carl Ratzat in New Meadows, Idaho. His dad wrote to him and said, "If it's you, come home." It was confirmed that it was his family. Dad and Mom were married on September the 9th, 1926, and a few days later he received word that his mother had died. He rushed to Salem and was shocked when his mother opened the door. She explained that it was his dad that had died. His sister Helen was 14 years old at that time. She and her mom picked hops and worked in the cannery to exist. After Dad and Mom got married, they bought the Liz Ranch northwest of her childhood home in Meadows Valley. They raised peas, well, I already told you all of that. And then Dad farmed until 1943 when he moved the family to New Meadows. And then he worked and out at in the timber industry. He and a friend, Les Helm, fell timber. They had one of the first power saws that came out to do that with, and then he later worked at the Tamarack Mill. He retired as a fireman from the Tamarack Mill after working in the mill several years. He then did the irrigating for Inez Wilson in the summers, and also he was Albert Campbell's chauffeur. And I've got a smiley face by that because my dad was quite the driver. He spent many hours fishing. He and Mother drove to Alaska and spent one summer fishing. The stress of that trip aged him, and his health never fully returned. He died in 1981 and is buried in New Meadows Cemetery next to his son Walter.
What year was your dad born?
1896.
What year did he actually arrive here?
1925.
Now, you said something about one of the early chainsaws. Do you know anything about what it was like?
It was called a distant, I think, wasn't it? Do you know? A big distant saw. It took 2 men almost to carry him or handle him.
One on the motor and then one out on the stinger now in the old distance. And then a lot of guys, when they wanted to shut them off, just grabbed the spark plug.
Yeah.
Because the switches a lot of times didn't work. And they just,
That's the part of it. Now, was it your dad that was a driver for Albert, a chauffeur, did you say?
Yeah. Chauffeur Albert Camel was in a car accident that left him quite disabled. That's a big
So
word.
it's after that?
And after that, why, Dad would drive him so he could go down and look at his ranch out here and drove him around and so forth.
And what was that comment you made about being quite a driver? What was...
Well, Leonard Crow would tell you that the guys at the garage called him Mr. Magoo. Because of the times he came in with the car with the door handle knocked off of the driver's side, or one time he was going too close behind a fellow pulling a sailboat with the mast down, and he ran the mast through the radiator. Little things like that.
Well, did Albert always want him to drive faster? Because Albert was such a fast driver.
I don't know how they got along. He was, but evidently they managed it.
How long did he drive for?
Oh, I don't know. Whether he was still doing that when Albert, I have no idea just how long he did that, but I remember him doing it. He had several drivers, not just my dad.
Well, Leonard, somebody wanted to know if you had any idea about timber right here in the valley. Sometimes you see stumps. Do you know anything about logging or what kind of trees there were here?
my dad said here in the valley was just strictly nothing but big pine trees, no second growth, up until before Jan Morgan come in here. I can remember stumps at my house 4 or 5 feet across. You know, they've been years.
Did it come down into the valley, like out into the
Well,
pasture land?
not a great deal further than what it is right now.
Yeah. Huh.
But there was some big timber here back then.
Yeah. Somebody said your dad split a lot of shakes.
Dad split a bunch of shakes. All them buildings there at the house, the home ranch, the roof was shakes, and he split every one of them.
Did he do that for other people too?
I don't, to my knowledge, he did not.
Yeah.
But it was quite an art. I've seen him try to teach other people how to split shakes. Yeah, it was kind of, like I said, a lost cause. Even I was in that category.
Did he use a froe?
A froe and then a wooden mallet.
Yeah.
And they cut them shake bolts 2 feet long, and then they would split them around the outside, probably that wide on the outside, maybe that wide on the inside. And they would split shakes out of them. And what they would do, they'd take that froe and then drive it through with a wooden mallet. And they would split till they got it pretty square, and then they would take one off the other way and then start again. And they come up pretty good looking shakes.
Were they tamarack?
Tamarack, strictly tamarack.
Were there tamaracks in any different locations than now? Were they pretty close down here?
Basically about the same, and a lot of these, we're talking about split, but a lot of these rail fences here, years and years ago, were split out of red fir.
Really?
They would go out and then chop a piece out of the side of them, and if they would split, then they would take pins and go out there and cut it down and split it in the wintertime where it was froze. You could split it if it was froze. If you didn't, you had to wait till it died and dead, and then you could split it. The red fir would last longer than tamarack.
Yeah. Did anybody use black powder wedges, that you know?
Black powder wedges, and some of them, I've seen several of them, some of them was good, some of them weren't.
Yeah.
My dad had one that was.
Was good?
Was, yeah, the one he had, you had to drill a hole, a 2-inch hole, and then get it with just a round pipe, and they would drive it in there. And then there was a little deal hole in the back, stick a fuse in there, and touch it off, and it would just let it wide open.
What happened to the wedge when it went off? Did it go flying, I suppose?
Some of them stayed, sometimes they went a little further, a little harder to find. Some of the good ones was actually, I got one of them now. They were actually looked just like a wedge that you drive in a block, and only it was hollow. And then you drive it in there, and then there was a fuse went in the back, and then where it was split, it was spread it out the way you could make posts or whatever. And most of them had a wire or something tied on it so you could tie a chain on it, so you could find it.
Some of the rail fences that are still around, are they pretty old, or have people replaced them, rebuilt them?
Some of them are still around, was like where they was when I was a kid.
Yeah.
The rail fence will last a long time because they don't get wet and then dry, wet, and dry. That's what rots it. And the reason why rail fences stand up, I'll never forget this, I have to tell this on my dad. Ray Bennett used to live around here, and he was his little handyman. He put a rail fence around the Payette Lakes Clinic. And I come by one day while he was working the old clinic, and I said, Ray, you're not doing that right. He said, why? What do you mean? And they would take and drive 2 posts, and then Ray would just tie them together here, and right above, like lay a rail or 2, and then he'd put a wire and tie the post together. And then he'd put another one up at the top, and I said, you're not doing that right. He said, why? If you would move that bottom wire up, and then put your rail on it, it would tighten that till actually where it would just keep it from falling over. And he said, now I got to tell you, who told me how to lay this? And I said, well, they tell you, but he told you wrong. He said, well, it was your dad. And so I went home and jumped out about it. He said, you're right, I did tell him wrong. But that's the reason why rail fence will stand so long.
Yeah.
And that bottom rail, the old timers would put a rock on the ground to keep that from being in the ground.
Did they use posts, or they used just
They used,
zigzag?
well, the ones that's got posts, they would drive the post, and then the bottom rail or 2 would lay on the worm type. And then they'd come up 4 or 5 inches, put a wire between the 2 posts, and lay their rail on that. And it was quite a deal the way they laid them rail fences straight. Did you ever notice they're just as straight as a string? And they had an 18-inch worm in them, most of them, back and forth. And they would stretch a wire from point A to point B, and then they had a little stick with a board 9 inches long, nailed on it. And they would stick that in the ground, and that would be their worm for that way. And then they would go up 10 feet, stick it in again, and that would be their worm for that way. Then they come up with an 18-inch worm that way, back this way.
Yeah.
A 10-foot rail, or 11-foot rail on an 18-inch worm would lay 10 feet between the posts.
Did you ever work on them, build them?
Well, the fence around my yard is rail, but it's only 3 rails. I put a wire under each rail to kind of hold it up. Well, it was there for like 30 years before I rebuilt it, so it must have worked.
How many rails do they generally have?
Depending on how high the fence was and how big the rails was, I guess you'd say, because, you know, they would start and lay them up, I think, about probably 4.5 feet would be my guess. Pretty close, maybe 5 to the top.
Yeah. Any other stories you ladies have to add that's come up along the way?
Well, I have a funny one about my sister-in-law. I have a funny one about my sister-in-law and I. We lived up on the ranch, of course, and she lived down the road there. And we were always helping each other out, you know, off and on. And anyway, Charlie was working for somebody at the time, and I looked out the window, and there were 2 big old sows out in the oat field. So I called Doris up and asked her if she'd come up and help me get those sows back in. So she dropped everything and come up, you know. Oh, we worked and finally got those sows back in the barn. And we were so proud of ourselves. And so when Charlie came home that night, I told him, well, the sows had got out in the oats, but Doris and I got to put back in the barn, put them in their pens. So he went down to the barn to see about them. Come back up and said, well, I need you to come help me. He said, you put the sow in, the wrong sow in with the baby pigs, and she had pigs of her own. We need to separate them out.
Did they hurt any of the little ones?
No, it was surprising because usually a sow like that would kill odd pigs, you know. Anyway.
How about some audience questions or comments or stories?
Nita, talk about the electrical system in your bar, in that barn and out there.
That was probably the fanciest barn in the valley. It's been gone now for several years. It burned down after we moved out of there, but it was supposedly about one of the biggest barns in the valley that was still standing. And it had ramps on each end, so you could drive a wagon through it, all the way through it. And it had carbide lights. That's something you really don't hear of very much. But the house had carbide lights, and the barn had carbide lights. And
Now, who built all this?
well, I think probably Luce built the barn because it was Luce, the one that homesteaded the place, because it was there when Thelma's folks bought the place. And it had a big wide stairway, maybe wasn't quite as wide as this table is long, going up to the hay mow. And it had 12 stalls for cows, milking stalls, and 4 double horse stalls for the work horses, and a granary, and a milk room, and it was quite a barn. Of course, it was in disrepair somewhat when we moved up there, but it was really a fantastic barn, and the kids in town loved to come out and visit because they could play in that big barn.
Yeah. Now, you said something about the electrical system. Did it have electricity later?
Well, and I don't understand that.
Oh,
Explain
there was a big round tin thing out a ways there, and you mixed something together, and it created this carbide gas. And carbide was a gas. And anyway,
the carbide set in a pan, and then you put water around the outside, and you set, you know, that's what caused the gas to go, and then it was piped in wherever the lights were.
had fancy little light fixtures in the barn.
We had carbide lights in the house.
Yeah, and even had a spigot for an iron in the kitchen.
So then you lit them individually?
I don't know, it didn't work, but, you know, it was long ago.
We had carbide in our house out at Grangeville, and it had a flint on it. And there was a light in each room, and you just lit that, the flint. And
Were they very bright?
Well,
They be
it was
like-
pretty bright compared to a coal oil lamp. I've seen my grandfather, 93 years old, stand under one of those lights and read.
Yeah. We have a carbide miner's light, that went on a helmet in the Museum of Council. And there was a guy down there that had experience using those. And he said they were pretty dim when you got in the dark and tried to see much, but I don't know, they were real small.
Well, it had quite a little flame to it.
Yeah.
But that's all I knew as a kid, when I was a kid, the carbide lights.
Yeah. And was it a rock type, or stone type material? That what the carbide looked like?
I'm not sure, Larry, what was the carbide? It was kind of,
Was it like a soft rock?
Yeah.
yeah,
it was,
because you got it in packages,
Yeah.
in sacks.
I don't know really, but it was gas. When the water hit it, why it was formed gas.
Formed gas.
But you could buy it.
You bought it in sacks.
Well, you had a question?
I didn't have a question, I had a couple of little stories that I wanted to tell about Leonard's dad. I came to the valley about 33 years ago, and his place is above our ranch, and he and my husband were really good friends. And he thought an awful lot of that old fellow, and so he'd come by an awful lot. The first time I ever met him, I mean, he loved to chew. He never signed, but he didn't have his chew running down his chin. But he was the most polite little fellow, and my husband's on the cemetery board, and here we still hand dig most of the graves. And he said that he didn't think there was ever a person that died, up until the time Charlie died, that he wasn't there to take his turn throwing the dirt in. He worked right along with the men. I don't think he ever missed a grave digging. And if there anything was going on in the ranch, why, he was always down there. If he could see us down the hill working on something, why, he was always down there. He'd pitch right in. You didn't ask him or anything, and he'd work right along. He could outwork the young ones. And this story, I don't know. I'll tell you what Charlie told us, but I'm sure Leonard can tell it better. He got into a bit of a situation and had to be life flighted to Boise. Well, when he got back, he was able, he knocked on her door, and he had a handful of papers. He was so upset. They were the bills, and he had to come and tell Darrell. We'd heard about the experience, but he had to come and tell him about it. He was so mad how much that cost. And apparently, it was when we were having fires, I think, and everybody knows how wasteful the Forest Service is, and they take their sack lunches and everything and just throw them out at the dump. And Charlie, went out there and visited all the time with the other old guy. So he picked up these little packages that, that they are sealed with fruit and stuff in them. And he must have opened one and popped one of those in his mouth, and they were dry. Well, then I took it to be, this is what he said anyway, when the saliva puffed it up, he cut his wind off, and he passed out, and they thought he had had a heart attack. All the guys standing around there talking wasn't paying attention. He ended up being life-flighted. Well, partway down there, he come to. The thing went down, and he'd come out of it pretty good, and they had to go on, but he was really upset because he'd asked that pilot if he couldn't land somewhere and pick somebody else to cheapen the trip up. He said he wasn't having none of that. He said, and I just want you to look at these. I mean, he just couldn't believe that an airplane could cost that much.
You remember that?
That's a new one on me, but that sounds about right.
He gave rounds about every morning, and he'd stop. Yeah, he always stopped out at Jack Steiner's, and you could just almost set your clock. Right, he had different places. Oh, down at Marvin Dobson's was another place. And you could almost set your clock by him because he'd make his rounds about every day.
Yeah.
Yes, he done that every day. He would go to town, like you said. He had his rounds, he would make his rounds. And the funny part of it is, if he didn't would make his rounds. I don't know how many times people would call me, "Where's Charlie? We haven't seen him for a day or two." And a lot of times at that time, I was working late, and maybe I wouldn't sing because he'd be home in bed and I wouldn't know, but he always picked up my mail, and then he would lay it on my freezer. And if the mail was there, I knew it was all right. If it wasn't, well, then I had to go see. And thankfully, the mail was always there.
I don't think he was the only bad driver in the family because his pickup, he slapped out, you couldn't put your finger down on it anywhere where there wasn't a dent. I don't know what he backed into, but.
His garage. Let's put it this way, there's one post on it that's just hanging on by a few slivers.
Marla?
Well, I was kind of new to the valley, but I kind of helped the Historical Society. This must have been like in the early 80s. And I chased Charlie down because two women had come from out of state. They were from the Midwest, and they were looking to find out something about their uncle. And two uncles, actually. They were brothers. And no one could tell them anything, and they came to me thinking that I would know. It must have been like maybe the later 80s. But anyway, I decided that Charlie would know about someone from the past, because this is a long time ago. And this is when I really respected Charlie for his honesty, because he didn't really, he didn't put on airs for anybody. And so I chased him down. I went to Marvin's, I went to